Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to our webinar this morning slash afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Cindy Brown. I am the coordinator for the Access VSA International Network, and I am thrilled to welcome you to our panel discussion, Building Community Connections, Partnerships for Cultural Organizations. We have some fabulous panelists with us today. They'll get and introduce themselves in a minute, but I wanted to let you know that we have Aliza Greenburg of the Museum Access Coalition and Learning Spring School, Josh Taylor, associate professor of special education, Department of Teaching and Learning at Washington State University, and Karen Waltuck, director of the Consortium for Customized Employment at JobPath NYC. So the way it's going to work today, we're going to have some introductions. We're going to have this panel discussion where I'm going to be asking our panel some questions, but then we'll also have time for Q&A afterwards. You can either put your questions in the Q&A box. If you want them anonymous, you can put them on the chat. You can also wait and raise your hand, and if you would like to speak your question, just let us know that as well. We're going to be talking about, mostly this is going to be focused on folks with developmental disabilities, which is the basic definition is a disability that occurs, that's going to be a lifelong disability, but occurs before age 22. So we're mostly talking about those folks because of the way that the programs intersect. And I think we're about ready to get going. So I'm going to stop sharing this slide and let Aliza introduce herself.
Hello, my name's Aliza Greenburg, as Cindy said. I have been the project leader for the Supporting Transitions project at the Museum Arts and Cultural Access Consortium, or MAC for short, for about 10 years. The Supporting Transitions project seeks to increase opportunities for adults with developmental and intellectual disabilities, including autism, at cultural organizations. So we've been partnering with various cultural organizations for employment, but also for recreation programming, volunteer opportunities, and other ways for these folks to get involved in the cultural field. I'm also the community outreach coordinator at the Learning Spring School, which is a K through 8 school for autistic students. And I run our alumni programs there, so I also have a lot of involvement in kind of connecting both the school age population to cultural organizations, but also our alumni who are teens and adults with autism. Those are some of the things that I do.
Thank you, Josh.
Nice to meet you all. I'm Josh Taylor, as Cindy said, an associate professor of special education at Washington State University. And my background is as a special educator. So I worked primarily with students with autism and intellectual and developmental disabilities in K-12 settings. And a lot of my work, as a practitioner and now as a researcher, really focused on the transition space. So thinking about, what can we do while students are still in school and match them up with services and with agencies that can support that movement from school into adulthood and specifically career development and work. So really a lot of my research focuses on how can we figure out how to get these systems to work. So I'm really excited to kind of talk a little bit about some of these issues. I've also kind of worked a little bit from the time I was a special educator in the arts and cultural arts space, supporting inclusion and accessibility initiatives. That's a kind of passion of mine. So really excited to be here with y'all. And I'm also part of the creative careers in the arts team with the evaluation team. So
Thank you. Thank you. And Karen.
Hi, I'm Karen Waltuck, and I'm the director of the Consortium for Customized Employment. The inception was in 2012. I've been the director since then. And our mission is really twofold. The first is we're a consortium of 14 provider agencies in New York City, and we build a community of practice We do trainings in customized employment, which is specific strategy for employment for for adults with developmental disabilities. And my second mission is to make partnerships with businesses and cultural institutions to have them understand and engage this incredibly underserved workforce talent pipeline. So yeah, there we are.
I am so excited about this. Well, let's start at the beginning. So, a lot of people are probably not even aware that there are partnership organizations that are looking for partnerships. So, what types of agencies and organizations may be looking for them in both programming or employment? And anyone, just raise your hand when you want to.
Um,
I
Aliza.
mean, I can start. This is Aliza speaking, and I guess I was jumping in because this is where Karen and I have really collaborated together. So at the Museum Arts and Culture Access Consortium, or MAC, we started by bringing together a working group of agencies like the Consortium for Customized Employment and many of the agencies that are part of the consortium to start to think about how can these agencies connect with cultural organizations? How can we leverage all the opportunities that cultural organizations have to fulfill a lot of the goals that agencies like the ones that Karen works with are trying to achieve. So by partnering, we were able to, on our end as MAC, work with cultural organizations to create new opportunities, and then bring those opportunities to the consortium. And the consortium was such a wonderful partner because they had a host of exciting candidates to then fill these opportunities at these cultural organizations. We've also worked together just sharing expertise around what cultural organizations can do to become more inclusive and more accessible in the employment sphere. And we've learned, I think, so much from the consortium and from Karen about that. So I'm sure uh, Karen might want to jump in, but I was kind of starting us as a pair because that's really where we've worked together.
And
yeah.
Karen, yeah, I'd love to have you jump in and also explain to folks. A lot of people don't know, are these government agencies? Are these nonprofit? What are they? These agencies and these organizations like yours that want to partner with people.
Yeah, so we're funded by the state and the federal government, so there's no cost to the businesses or cultural institutions at all. And what we're there to do is to help businesses think about their needs and also to translate that into tasks versus like a Renaissance positions most of the time. Um, Jobs are listed, many different types of skills are needed. So in order to engage this population, you really want to, and to build partnerships, you really want to define what it is that you need to get done. When are those, where are the unmet needs? And then to look at it in terms of task-based. And also, and so that's how we like to partner with, for success. But the agencies, I mean, I think schools for those with developmental disabilities, I think colleges with access departments, I think teachers' colleges, employer networks, workforce development, departments of labor, all of these, and then provider agencies, all of them are looking for partnerships. So I think provider agencies often to institutions are going to be the most robust because we can help on so many different levels to help you identify those things, to cull individual candidates um, to help with interviewing process, to in accompany that individual with a job coach, to, we can give so much more than most other types of organizations. But I certainly, since your question is who's interested, I think I need to make a bigger umbrella there to answer that question.
Okay, great. Thank you. That was great. And you give us a nice big umbrella and some specific things. And I want to get back to the role of tasks and skills in a little bit here. But Josh, I saw you nodding your head and I want
Yeah,
to see what, yeah.
yeah. As Karen said, that was great, and maybe I can piggyback on some of what Karen shared about, those community rehab providers or those nonprofits that work within communities that really provide services, and maybe it's helpful too to kind of think back to like what specific funding they get from the state and federal government. So those come from kind of two main pots when it comes to providing employment services for folks with developmental disabilities. The first is through state vocational rehabilitation agencies. And so those are really focused, those are kind of driven by the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act. And those go to providing kind of individualized services to help folks get jobs within the community. So those can include, things like assessment and what we call discovery, or kind of figuring out what folks' interests are to really drive that process. It also can provide services for what we call pre-employment transition services, since that's really an emphasis of the most recent piece of the legislation that kind of guides folk rehab, that really mandates that they work with schools and with school-age students more. And so what you're seeing in states and communities is a growth of a lot more programs that really focus on how can we start that career development process a little earlier for folks. So I think that's a real opportunity where there are some really innovative things happening within kind of the state vocational rehabilitation, those local offices, community rehab providers, as Karen touched on, that are receiving funding to provide those services directly. In other communities, it's the voc rehab counselors that are providing those services directly. So there's some kind of difference between state and community to community. The other piece is through developmental disability agencies, or DDA. And those are really aimed at, a broader range that doesn't just include employment, but can also include that long-term employment. And for individuals that may need kind of follow-on support, check-ins, support kind of maintaining employment, and with career progression, that there's developmental disability, or what we call Medicaid waiver services, without getting too in the weeds with it, are kind of state funds that can be directed to kind of help support some of those processes. So getting to know some of those players within the state, within the community. I've found that Voc Rehab and DDA are both really good matchmakers to identify those community rehab providers that are doing really excellent things and maybe looking for partnerships, may have programs that where they're looking for employers to kind of partner with and things like that. The other group I'd really recommend, looking for and reaching out to are the CILs, the Centers for Independent Living. And those really kind of came out of the independent living movement in the 1960s and 70s, and are local hubs that are run by people with disabilities, for people with disabilities, to really kind of orient. And I almost think of kind of point guarding or quarterbacking, and just kind of helping direct folks with disabilities to services that may be out there, and really kind of getting a broader sense of, hey, how can we help navigate some of these, frankly, complicated systems that folks have to interact with.
Fabulous. Thank you. Thank you. That's great answers to all this question. A lot of information too. And so you mentioned that maybe people might get in touch with Voc Rehab or EDA connections. Aliza and Karen, I know you're both based out of New York, but do you also have are there other ways that you suggest people find these organizations or the contacts in their communities?
Hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple ways. I mean, Josh and Karen mentioned the state agencies that support adults with developmental disabilities. So each state will have a office of they're all called different things to just make it harder for everybody. Ours is the ours is the Office for People with Developmental Disabilities, but that's not what it's necessarily called in other states. But the office that supports those services is usually how individuals access the vocational rehabilitation funds and services. So they can point you to the various agencies that are providers of those services. But another really great resource, I think, I mean, you could also search in your area, like employment support organizations or employment development for people with developmental disabilities and agencies like JobPath, which houses the consortium where Karen works, and other agencies will come up. But I think another great resource are high schools that serve people with developmental disabilities. Josh mentioned that there's this new kind of access to work initiative that's starting to put programs through what we call Access VR, but these vocational rehabilitation programs in the high schools, and agencies are becoming providers of these programs. So that's another great way to connect, to just partner with high schools. I know in New York City, Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts has been doing a wonderful program where they had a group of ambassadors who were just volunteers from the community working on their campus, doing wayfinding, doing information, giving ticket um, support, and they created a cohort of access ambassadors where they partnered with high schools. They started with high schools throughout New York City that were serving teens with developmental disabilities and trained them to be the access ambassadors, the people working on the campus. And now that program has really expanded. I know they've worked with several agencies and have many of those people who started in their teens working as access ambassadors have moved on to be guest services employees at Lincoln Center. So that's just one example from a cultural organization of how like a agency and a work with an agency or school settings can then support people moving into cultural employment.
I love that program.
May I also add that I
Yeah.
think community colleges, I know the or colleges that are have more and more really robust accessibility departments and also employment departments. So that's a very nice jumping off point for, I think, because it's so different state to state on which ones have the most robust or any at all um, uh, programs for employment for people with, or any kind of support for people with disabilities. I actually heard Alaska is very good. I was like, whoa, and Washington actually. And anyway, so I think that's a really nice place to start as well.
Great. Josh, you want to add to that too?
Yeah, just as far as like kind of figuring out what's happening, and I love some of the kind of hearing about these great things that are going on, but I kind of it can feel a little daunting, especially I mean even for me as a researcher, kind of going in and working in a different community in Washington. We've got some projects running up in Spokane, and it's been having to figure out, hey, what's going on? Who are the folks that are kind of at the table, and what are the really innovative things that are happening that we can partner with and share out, and how can we benefit from each other? It's really helpful to, I think, connect with some figuring out, and it depends on for city to city and community to community on like who those groups are, but often it's organizations like the ARC, Autism Society, that have disability fairs or other events that happen periodically that include VR and DDA in the schools and some of these other folks that are doing really these cool, innovative things, but just kind of finding out through some of these events that are happening if folks aren't already plugged in of kind of looking at what are the disability agencies that may provide broader services that aren't just employment, but may provide kind of a networking hub to really kind of figure out what's going on to be able to kind of partner with. And I think folks would be really excited for folks on this call to join and come in with some enthusiasm and opportunity into those spaces.
I think that's a great idea because, yeah, the disability fairs, everybody's gathered in one place and you learn about all sorts of people doing all sorts of things, all sorts of organizations and nonprofits and agencies. That's fabulous. Wonderful. Um, we had a question really quickly. Josh, you answered it in the question and answer, but it seems like kind of a basic one we might want to make sure everyone gets before we go on. And someone had asked what expand on what a provider agency is. There's a link that we will put in the chat, but Josh, you had answered that question while I put the link in there. You want to
Yeah,
explain your
I mean,
answer?
essentially, those provider agencies are often called community rehabilitation providers or CRPs. I know in Virginia and I think a couple other states they're called employment service organizations or ESOs. But essentially, they're often nonprofits. They don't have to be. I've got a colleague who's done some really cool research out of East Tennessee State University, and she has a vendorship, a CRP, and essentially these are organizations that work with the state agencies to get to go through an application process to be listed as a provider organization, and then people with disabilities that are found eligible for this funding and services through the state, either through VR, and that has its own eligibility process, or through a specific Medicaid waiver that's often administered by those developmental disability agencies, then have choices about who they want to work with. And so they can kind of coordinate and decide, which agency or which organization rather, which CRP may be a good fit for providing the services that they want and meet their goals for employment in their careers and work with them. Trying to think if I touched on all the parts. Karen, or Lisa,
No,
anything to add?
I think I'm JobPath is a smaller agency, although the consortium has like Goodwill and HRC and much larger agencies that are part of the consortium. But they focus on the entire life of an individual with a developmental disability. So it could have housing, it can have training, it can have day have without walls, it can have teaching modules, it can have all kinds of things and employment and supporting the employment. So and a lot of it is funded, as he was saying, by Medicaid, which is a federally funded stream. So, yeah.
Well, that brings me to a great question, the next one, which is, so what are exactly the kinds of supports? What are the roles that that the government agencies, organizations like yours, Karen, um, or the ones that Josh was just talking about, any of these, how can they help? What's the role they play with the cultural organization? I know we've talked a little bit about funding, but I'd love to hear more about how that works. What do they fund? They fund job coaches? Do they fund one-on-one supports? Um, and both in maybe Aliza, you can talk about how that might work in programming too. And then also, Karen, I know you mentioned training for staff and things too. So I'd love to hear from all of you about what kinds of things, what kind of supports and what kind of role these agencies can play in with cultural organizations who are looking to serve this population better.
Well, now just mention the trainings. There are collaborations sometimes with the city, MOPD, the Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities, has etiquette trainings, disability and etiquette trainings. Some nonprofits do as well. There's something called JAN, JAN, Ask Jan, and they have a lot of videos and different kinds of training and white papers and all kinds of things like that. It's really quite interesting. But I think the most important thing is to remember that humans are humans and that respect, having staff watch coaches interact and support an individual having ongoing conversations with managers. I think that is where it's at. And when an individual, when the provider agency does their job and matches an individual that has the skill that will thrive in that environment, um, that the disability is an idiosyncrasy. And so, yeah, so the provider agency is doing lots of things. They're helping the business define a task that's needed to be done and work with them. They are um, uh, culling, curating the match. They are providing a job coach. They are supporting those, folks on the job. They're interacting with the employee, the employer. They are doing lots of all of it. They should be anyway. So
Great. Josh or Aliza?
Yeah, so I guess everything that Karen said is like so beneficial to cultural organizations and part of our role at MAC, and I'll put the website in the chat for MAC because I know somebody asked for that in the Q&A. But the the I think the cultural organizations aren't used to working, or many cultural organizations, some are very used to it, so no generalizations here, but aren't used to working in these ways that partner with organizations for employment. So often the process is post a job posting, wait for applications, and look through them and then select for interview and select candidate. And what we've seen is like that pathway really leaves out a large portion of our population just because of the barriers that are put up by that job application process. And I'll pause for the interpreter switch. What we do is we try to work with cultural organizations to disrupt that process and think differently about how to access candidates, and also think differently about the job posting and what information is going in the job posting. Often we have information in a job posting that makes people feel like everything under the sun is required to do a certain job when really in because that's the hope. The hope is like we'll get some magical candidate who will be able to do everything for the organization because we're so underfunded and understaffed, and that is all true. But in practice, in reality, nobody is able to do all those things. Really honing in on what are the duties of this particular role, focusing on what the duties are, not how somebody has to do them, because things can be done in a multitude of ways. Um, and then we really work with, thinking about outreach. Where is this job being posted? How are we getting the word out to a new group of people? And that's where we work with Karen and the consortium. And we do trainings with cultural organizations too on all these practices. And then thinking about the interview process and are they really interviewing the candidate for the job? Like, are they assessing the candidate in the um, qualities or responsibilities that the job really requires? So in an interview, it's usually conversation, it's personability, it's thinking on the spot. And these are not often the requirements of the jobs that are being hired for. Sometimes they are, but not always. And so, how do we change to more task-based interview processes? How do we prepare people better for the interview by providing photos and questions ahead of time and things that take out the need to be like an improv performer in an interview and move to really assessing like, can this person complete the tasks that we're looking for in this job that are really going to help the organization? Um, and then we work with the agencies and job coaching, I think, is kind of like the hidden gem of employment that people don't really know about. And it's like such a benefit to an organization to work with somebody who has a job coach and can support the transition into a job. I mean, I wish at my first job I had someone there to coach me and help me just get acclimated to that first experience. Even things like, hey, you're going to be put in this room and fill out these tax forms, and it's your first job ever. And I remember being like, can I call my dad? Because I don't know what to put on these tax forms because I've never done this before. And so, like, all these little things that are like hidden, unexpected situations in a job that the job coach can really support and they can help look at how is this individual best learning tasks and support that process. They can work with the organization to best serve the needs of the individual. And that's all offered by these agencies. And so partnering with them is such a win for everybody. Um, and yeah, we do offer job coaching as well. We have an apprenticeship program where we do like it's kind of to help cultural organizations get their feet wet in customized employment or just in inclusive employment. So sometimes they're creating a more customized role. Sometimes they're just creating an internship for a role that already exists, but only making it available to people with developmental disabilities or intellectual disabilities. And that way they're breaking the cycle of kind of these employment barriers that have been put up over time. So I don't know, that was a lot of
That's that's so
things.
fantastic. Thank you. I just want to pull the camera back for a second and to say, I think it's really important to say, how does this really differ from a neurotypical? I mean, any newcomer is gonna need dedicated time and a supervisor. Don't, we're not like expecting any more or less, and I think also this removing unnecessary requirements, it is clearly filtering out lots of different individuals, and it does not necessarily just point to this particular population. And I remember at the Met having someone, for doing a greeting job needed a college education, so it's not just this particular population. I also want to say something about the idea of um, accommodation. I mean, I think there's an idea of what is this accommodation? It could just be headphones. It just could be like um accessorized. So just, they don't have to be there exactly at 9 o'clock. It could be something so that there's going to be a specific desk. That's the big accommodation. So I think it's really important sometimes to pull the camera back and say, what is there really any difference here? And then just like a sidewalk cut in for a person that has a wheelchair, that is going to make it like there is no disability. So I think that it's important to say, for some of these things, that it's not really any different. It's just a different way of thinking.
And I want to get to tasks and skills and customized employment and some accommodations. But also, Josh, I wanted to give you a chance to, are there other roles? I know especially you work with schools and transition things. Are there other roles that organizations or agencies play or other kind of supports that they can give to cultural organizations who are interested in including this population?
Yeah, I mean, I think Karen and Aliza kind of touched on a lot of really great parts of, I think, the important role that I think job coaches play as far as like mediating those. When we look at transition age youth and students that are still in school, this pre-employment transition services typically are more oriented towards, initial career exploration. So it may be things like provide, job shadowing opportunities, which may not directly lead to employment right away, but may open minds and sort of to possibilities of maybe an internship down the road and maybe a career pathway through some of those adult service pathways that we talked about through VR and DDA. So there's some really cool programs that I think are growing out of that, the pre-ETS or pre-employment transition services with partnerships between schools and community rehab providers and VR to provide some of those initial experiences to check out, see what's out there, as well as we haven't really talked about it, but one of the big barriers with this population is those soft skills, right? So how do you navigate being part of a workplace? And so opportunities for both transition age youth and young adults to kind of get support from job coaches to navigate workplace culture, and some of those social expectations around navigating that part of things as well. And then I think what we're going to talk about customized employment in a little bit, so I won't touch on that. But I think Kara had a really good question in the chat about like I think sometimes the way we talk about and frame some of these cool things that are happening in New York and Washington, where we have like the thing already built. We have these great programs that are having good outcomes. It can feel a little daunting to see like how does that process work? But the reality is, a lot of the work I do is in rural spaces. These are all about and can only ever be about sort of individual connections and matches, right? And it really starts with the individual and their strengths and interests and getting support from a job coach and from a CRP to be able to say, hey, this is not just we're creating kind of these blanket opportunities, but we have a person that's a match for that specific job. And I think we'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about sort of job carving and customization with that. But it really is. There's nothing magical about sort of these programs that can't be replicated with just forming partnerships and saying, hey, we're here. I want to work with you, and how can we sort of look at within our organization, how can we break down barriers? And as Karen touched on, what are some free and low cost accommodations that can really help us to be a more inclusive workplace that can really include folks with disabilities as part of the workforce?
And Josh, I think what you just said is partly an answer to a question we have in the Q&A, which is about um, some smaller states, smaller communities don't have the quantity of arts jobs and or folk rehabs and CILs don't really understand cultural arts. They want to know if you'd seen a model where an interested organization can get funding to design a job and employ a person that doesn't exist. And it sounds like you're talking almost exactly about that by creating these, by partnering with people to create these kind of positions. And I know Karen and Aliza, you probably have some thoughts about this as well. I know part of it's going to be getting to the right person or organization, but how do you help them say, I really want to do this. I want to employ somebody, and nobody seems to be doing it here, and I don't know how to get started.
I think it's coming to the table in meeting with those folks, and it may not be an immediate match. I mean, part of what we know from the research on supported and customized employment is like having a match between folks' strengths and interests with that job is super important. And so if we're just sort of, hey, I want to employ a person with disability, who you got, regardless of their interest, that's not going to work out. And that's part of why we've seen kind of poor outcome data for decades, is because I don't think we've done a really good job of that match and that really thorough assessment of what folks' strengths and interests are and preferences in the workplace. So I think that's really an important part of it. I would say the place I've heard and learned about the most innovative models is through the community practice and through our networks through LEAD and sort of those spaces where I feel like every month I'm hearing about a new innovative approach and a way to partner. But I think it really starts with just reaching out and saying, hey, we're here. We want to work. If you have folks that are interested in careers in the arts, let's talk more. Inviting
Mhm.
folks in to do trainings. I think Karen touched on it earlier. It can be a really helpful way. Hey, we may not be at the part, as partners where there's an immediate sort of employment opportunity, but hey, come in. How can we do some job shadowing? Can we do some reverse career fairs where we're going out and having folks with disabilities going to share their interest and as cultural arts organizations taking part in that and sharing a little bit more just to kind of get to know and have that be kind of on folks' radars as an opportunity. Because I think a lot of times, a lot of the young people that I work with don't, have interest and have abilities in some of these areas, but don't think about it as a possibility because that wasn't really one of the jobs on the interest inventory that they did in high school, right? So I think it kind of goes both ways too.
Okay. We have a bunch of questions. We have things to talk about. I'm trying to figure out the best use of our time going forward. First of all, is there anyone in the audience? I've got a couple of questions and answers in the box. If there anybody would like to speak a question, please raise your hand. If not, I'm just gonna kind of keep going through our Q&A in the box and in the webinar chat and weaving them in along with some other questions. So, okay, I'm gonna go with this one of the questions I think will also lead into what we were talking about with job matching and customized employment. Because somebody asked, what types of jobs and skills are you hiring individuals for?
Mhm.
And I there's been a real shift. I think a lot of people don't know there's been a shift in the way that employment is looked at in the last, I don't know, maybe 20 years, you guys, with customized employment and looking at particular tasks. Karen, I know that even on your website, you talk about trying to help people find overlooked tasks that so people can help to, so employees can help to, provide things. How do you match people? How do you find the skills? Um, I mean, what are you looking for? What kind of jobs have they done, and how are you trying to figuring out that those are matches?
So I don't think that you can pigeonhole what kind of rat. I mean, just like the general population, all areas. And people, some people have master's degrees, PhDs, and some just want to do dishwashing, right? So I think the where I like to start is what is internally, what do you want to do? What kind of a project, who are the decision makers, what's the funding, who are your advocates, then looking at your departments and say, what needs to get done? What's the work that's backed up? Why is someone doing something way below their pay grade? And what can make things run more efficiently? And when you have looked at that and defined it, then the provider organization who knows what the skills of that individual is, where they will thrive, they can make a match and then they can support that individual on the job. So I think it has to be, no job is going to last if it's altruistic, period. No way. It has to be a need that's filled by a person who has the skill to do it in a culture. We all have conditions for employment. I'm chatty. They could give a great organization tons of money right next down the street from my house. And they're going to put me in a room by myself with a computer. I'm going to say, no, no way. So in all individuals have those conditions. When they're in place, and you have the skill to do it, it's going to rock. And I think that's where you need to start.
Amen, Karen. Could not agree more about that emphasis on it being a match and really incorporating folks' strength. Maybe we could talk a little bit about customized employment. We haven't really touched on that as much. So customized employment is a specific kind of approach to employment that really gets it at its core use a lot of the components of supported employment as far as really emphasizing integrated placement of folks with disabilities, providing supports on the job rather than sort of this preparatory, folks have to get ready for work. But at its core, customized employment is really about this, creating jobs where maybe there are pieces of several job descriptions that there wasn't a job that existed before, but we're looking at, hey, what are the strengths that this person is bringing to the table? What might they be interested in within their organization? How can we think creatively about, okay, we had this person doing a bit of this, and this was kind of on their caseload or on their workload, and this person did a bit of this, and so maybe we can take this off their plate, this off their plate, and this off their plate. This is a great fit for this person that we have, where we can kind of think outside the box, and job coaches can be super helpful at kind of helping to think through, what are the overall sort of set of tasks that folks within an organization have, and how can we think about that match where maybe we thought about these job descriptions within these specific silos, but we don't, there's no reason we have to. We could save a lot of time instead of hiring just another person in that same role, to having somebody that can take a set of tasks off their table and be just a great match. And we've seen a lot of great success stories using customized employment for folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities.
Aliza, I bet you have some examples of this.
Yeah, well, I think, I mean, that's the very work that Karen does. So we try to um, direct any cultural organizations doing customized employment, like, or wanting to go into that way of doing things to her. But, I think we see a lot of success because nobody is a one size fits all. Everybody has, the things that they're good at and the things that they don't like, as Karen said. And so finding the tasks that are going to be right for that person. And it's interesting because I think the way in cultural organizations, usually the way employment works is people get that privilege of customization in their jobs as they move up, and they get to like take things off their plate and do that. But if we start early on, um, and customize jobs earlier on at the entry level, we're gonna see people stay at organizations much longer because they're doing the work that they want to be doing. And it's not just the higher up people who are staying because they've reached the point where they can customize. We're going to see those entry level jobs staying much longer because people are doing the work they want to be doing. And so that's why when we do find that match, as Karen said, and it rocks, like there's loyalty. Like I know at the Frick Museum, uh, I mean, 10 years ago when I started supporting transitions, Karen told me about the employees that JobPath had placed at the Frick Museum here in New York. And 10 years later, they're still there and they've added more people. And, they're happy in their jobs. They found the thing that they enjoy doing. And I think like it's hard for cultural organizations to reorganize because I know Kara, you put in the chat like if you're a smaller organization, the funding is hard and um but we're really talking about jobs that already like tasks just reorganizing the tasks that already exist and are needed and that are being hired for, and just reorganizing how they're allocated to different people within the organization. And I think we've seen smaller organizations really um, thrive by doing this work. We had a apprenticeship that we formed with National Dance Institute here in New York City, and it was really customized. They worked with the individual to see like what are the tasks that are um, going to really fit with this person. And it was such a great experience. And now they're working with us to do more training and think about their whole approach to employment in different ways. So I think when somebody really is open to the flexibility, it can really support the funding structure, like the funding that's already there, and like additional funding is not really needed because the job coaches and the people who come to support are paid for with the agency via money from the state. So, um, it's not an extra expense to have that support of a job coach, which I think is often unknown. Just so everybody knows, the job coach is free to the organization, and that is why it's such a benefit to the cultural organization.
So, kind of what I'm hearing you say is that in terms of, there may not be, we want to talk about funding because we have a couple questions there. There may not be additional funding needed. It's just that you look at this particular job position that you've already lost, you're looking for this to hire, and you're saying, okay, this could be done. These pieces of that job could be done. And then I take this from the executive director and I take this from the person who's front of house, and they all become this other job.
Yeah, I
And
have
that
that.
also, and then maybe there's also part-time opportunities and
Yeah.
things.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I have that at Columbia University Medical Center where this person who's very technical is working a lot on programming for many different departments at the same time, and they're just picking up that work. But also, I think that it's extremely financially beneficial to a living wage is different often for an individual with a developmental disability. And most of the time, they already have their health insurance, right? So if you need someone on those busy days for guest services at that specific time, but you don't, it's not a whole person, and the funding for that is actually much easier because you're not hiring a full person, which is usually 130% anyway. So it's actually oftentimes financially beneficial to look at what is not getting done and how it could be done better, et cetera. So, yeah,
Okay,
it's important that it needs to be done, that you're fitting someone into to something that needs to get done. You would
right.
be funding anyway.
The other thing I would say for organizations that are just getting started is, the customized employment can be great once you get to that part, but kind of it takes a while to figure out like where is that match and like how do we know which pieces to pull together? And that takes a lot of back end work from job coaches to do the assessment part of it, which looks a lot of times what we call situational assessments, which could include job shadows, it could include short-term kind of work trials or work-based learning experiences. And so even just signaling to those organizations like, hey, we're always open if you have somebody that is interested in a work-based learning experience. Sometimes those can occur and be funded through VR and through DDA. Seen a lot of short-term internship work-based learning experiences that can be great for an organization to kind of learn more about, what do we need to shift as an organization? How can we provide accommodations to support a person with a developmental disability and get a feel for that fit while also giving an opportunity for a person to like, hey, do I even like this? Like, I thought I like music, but I come in here and this is super overwhelming, this part. And so that process of allowing opportunities for folks to kind of figure out what they like and don't through those like kind of like low risk work-based learning experiences can be super beneficial. It may not be ending in employment, but really kind of can support kind of the employment of folks with disabilities long term
Yeah,
and really
so
benefit from that.
what does that organization want to do? First, you have to decide what do you want to do? Do you want to be a place where people can get experience? Do you have these jobs to fill? I mean, and then where are your advocates? Who's the decision makers? Like you would for any project, yeah.
Okay. Um, I know this doesn't relate exactly to programming. I mean, volunteer opportunities can be work-based, what did you call them? Work-based activities, work-based.
The term work-based learning experiences is the sort of specific activity that's authorized through pre-ets for transition age youth, but it's sometimes called work trials or yeah, lots of different names too. Lots of
Okay.
acronyms in this world, unfortunately.
Okay. So that seems like that also could be an opportunity for people to maybe it's a volunteer program that's like a volunteer internship, apprenticeship, some those kind of things.
It can be sometimes, through both pre-employment transition services and through individualized VR, state funds can be made available. So the person's paid for the work, but it doesn't come from the organization necessarily. And so again, it's working with those VR counselors, working with those CRPs to see what options are available. But just starting with creating those partnerships and saying, hey, we're kind of open to work. We're committed to employment first for people with disabilities, and we want to partner and we want to hire people with disabilities, and we also want to be a place where folks can come in and get those work experiences. And so all those parts I think are super beneficial, and you'll have those providers be very excited that for the enthusiasm and knowing that they have a strong partner and contact that they can reach out to when they do have a strong match and can start to build those relationships over time and build that culture.
Okay, I think you may have answered. I'll let you add to it, though. I was going to say one last question I wanted to ask everybody before we stop, and that was, what's an action that people can take, in the next 30 days by themselves? They don't have to, that can, help to further include this population, whether the people are looking at employment opportunities or maybe they're looking at recreational programming opportunities. What's one thing they can do? And Josh, it sounded like you're saying connect with the community, but I'm going to let you add to that if you'd like before I ask Karen and Aliza.
Sure, I'll add some specificity around it. I would say if you're starting from square one, find one of these community rehabilitation providers. Maybe they're doing some interesting stuff. Maybe you come across their website, and invite them to provide a training. See if they're available to come and do an inclusion and accessibility training, and an opportunity just to talk with them about their program, share a little bit about what you do, and just have an initial kind of matchmaking, a training that can be beneficial for all of your employees and staff, but also just an opportunity to kind of make that personal connection and have a chat about where there may be matches between those organizations to benefit people with disabilities.
Great, thank you. Karen, how about you?
Yeah, I think that, finding your community partner and that is, but I was thinking also, where in that institution do you want to start? And who is the person that's interested and invested in that? That's my beginning. That's what I think where you should, yeah.
Great, yeah. Find the space, find the ally. Right, awesome. Aliza.
Oh, everyone's taken them. But you mentioned recreation programs, and we didn't really get to talk about recreation programs. And I think that can be such a great pathway for somebody. So look at what programs already exist in your organization and are they accessible to adults with, or teens, or, are the programs that you already do accessible to people with developmental and intellectual disabilities? And what are the gaps, because people can really feel comfortable with an organization, and that can lead to a relationship that can lead to an employment opportunity. So also don't forget all the great work you're doing already, and just think about like how can it be expanded out to this population.
Great. We are out of time. I'm going to show you guys what's coming up next in our employee community of practice and Access VSA. But first of all, I want to thank our panelists. We didn't get to all the questions. We will be sending out an email once we get the recording captioned, and I will also grab some of those questions and see if any of our panelists might be willing to answer them. Um, you know, via email in what we send out. So we'll be doing that. And I want to let you know, thank you, Josh, Karen, Aliza, thank you so much. Let me really quick share my screen so you can see what else is coming up because we have some really cool stuff. And oh, maybe we do. There we go. Okay, because especially wanted to let you guys know we have an afternoon tea coming up. Our afternoon teas are, and this one particular one is free and open to all of them. Not all of them are, some of them are members only. This one is, it is supporting people with intellectual disabilities in programming and employment so we can continue this conversation. These are not panelists or webinars, they're facilitated discussions, but a lot of our members are working in these areas and have expertise or experience. So that would be great if you all can attend that. You can register on our website. We also have a webinar, Lessons in Motion for Educators, on the 22nd, and we'd love to have you join one of our employer community of practice meetings. We have two coming up, April 30th and May 28th. We will be talking a little bit more at one point about helping people with executive functioning issues, some accommodations for that. And basically, it's a place for people to get together, share their challenges and their successes, and learn a little bit from an expert. So thank you all for coming. And we will see you next time.
Cindy, can you show the next slide, please?
I'm trying really hard to do that. Let's see here. It is not forwarding. We don't know
Got
why.
it. You
There
got
it
it.
is. Thank you all. We will see you again.
Mm.